leave a like and subscribe. Nemini, can you tell me about the first time that you represented the Krays?
I was a young barrister. I'd got my first tenancy in chambers, which meant I had the right of audience in all the high courts. But there was at that time, this was 1956, a lot of prejudice against women. So I couldn't do any of the prosecution work in chambers. I wasn't even allowed to do traffic cases, dangerous driving and that sort of thing, because it was considered unsuitable for women.
Can I ask how old you were at this point?
I was about 22.
So young.
Yes. I was determined to try and make a go of it. And the clerk was very sympathetic. He just said, well, you have to find your own work. One way of finding it was to get dock briefs. You could do that, which meant you went down to the Crown Court and you sat in court, and the unrepresented prisoners were brought up and allowed to look at the array of unemployed barristers and say, I'll have him, I'll have her. And you'd occasionally pick up a client who liked the look of you. One day I was in chambers and the clerk said to me, oh, the boys have to go to the big match at Twickenham, so would you mind popping down to Arbour Square Magistrates' Court and doing a case there? So down I went to Arbour Square, and I was to represent the Kray brothers, who had been arrested the night before, Friday, and remanded in custody for Saturday morning. I didn't know them, I didn't know anything about them. Down I went, and I was accompanied by the managing clerk of the solicitor's firm, who was a splendid old Irishman called Paddy Pakenham. And I was greeted by a little lady with a pinafore and a basket on wheels full of dirty laundry. And she said, I'm their mum. They're definitely innocent. This is a stitch-up.
And what did you think? What was your first impression of them when you were presented with them in, I presume, a kind of interview room or something?
Well, yes, in a cell. So I was taken into the cell by Paddy Pakenham, who said, come on, let's find our clients and find out what it is they haven't done. And in the cell, there were two chaps sitting, identical twins, very smartly dressed. Their mother outside had brought them clean shirts for the morning, beautifully brill cream black hair, strong smell of expensive aftershave. I had no instructions, and I asked them what the problem was. And it appeared that the night before they had been walking down Whitechapel High Street distributing flyers for their new nightclub, which was called the Double R, and sticking them under the windscreen wipers of parked cars. And they'd been stopped by the police, who accused them of trying to break into the cars to steal. It wasn't clear whether they were stealing the contents or the cars. Anyway, they were arrested and remanded in custody. And they said they had no need to indulge in petty crime because they were very rich and successful businessmen. And they owned 3 clubs. Anyway, after a time, I wrote all this down, and we went into court. And the magistrate obviously knew them and said, morning, and they said, morning, sir. And pleasantries were exchanged, and then the young policeman gave evidence and said he'd seen them trying to steal. And it was quite obviously bogus, and the magistrate threw it out. After that, they were released on bail. But after that, I made regular appearances on Saturdays for them because they kept on getting arrested on Friday night.
It's a busy night.
And I kept on getting them acquitted, and I thought I must be the cat's whiskers as an advocate, which I wasn't. I was totally inexperienced and fumbling.
So how are you so successful?
It had something to do with the big chaps with scarred faces and their menacing presence in the back of the court. Witnesses were terrified of them. I mean, they had a strange reputation in the East End, and they still do, years after their death. Because they didn't prey on the public, but kept their crimes in-house, as it were, the public never hated them, and they were very generous in the way that they gave to charity. And if they went into a pub, they'd buy a drink for everybody in the pub. So they were popular. It's the Robin Hood syndrome. They stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And with time, the legend has grown. The legend now is much stronger than the reality was at the time, I think.
Do you think you could paint a bit of a picture for our listeners? From that moment that you met them, you embarked on quite prolonged working relationship representing them. What were your impressions of them as individuals? Because we often talk about them as a pair, but they were very different people.
There's something eerie about identical twins, which I think is really why they're remembered. They were different in that Ronnie was the dominant twin, but he was mad. He was paranoid schizophrenic, but a very strong personality. Reggie was much quieter, and I think if he'd been a single boy operating alone, he could have been a legitimate businessman, but he was very much under Ronnie's thumb. And Ronnie was totally unpredictable, and he had a frightening temper, which is one of the reasons why people were so scared of them. But in a way, people did idolize him. I mean, when Ronnie died, there were 34 limousines, and the streets were packed, the pavements were packed. It was like royalty. I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it?
It's really bizarre. I mean, your chance encounter with them and then subsequent relationship is also quite bizarre. Did you reflect on it at the time?
Well, it was ongoing. And at the time, I was just very happy because I worked for them. But then they recommended me to their mates, and I worked for other people. They asked me to represent Barbara Windsor's husband, Ronnie Knight. That was the first big Crown Court case I got. He was charged with robbing the Lotts Road power station, armed robbery with others, and he was remanded to the Old Bailey. I was sent down to try and get bail for him, which I failed to do, but I went down. And a bail application is a funny thing. It has a sort of formal shape, and you have to convince the judge, first of all, that your client won't run away, that he will attend his trial, but also that he's a solid citizen with family ties and social responsibilities and a good chap.
That's a harder bit to confirm.
It's quite difficult sometimes when you've got an obvious, ruthless villain. But Ronnie Knight was a very slick operator. And in my final submission, I said, and moreover, he's married to a famous actress. And of course, at that time, nobody knew this. And the boys in the press gallery were absolutely bananas. They had kept this under wraps, or Barbara had kept it under wraps. Anyway, outside the court, she came up to me and said, "You fucking little cow! How dare you let that out?" But in fact, it did her good. And the press loved her, and she became the little sort of Dolly Parton, the little gallant Cockney sparrow who stood by her man.
Absolutely, that kind of became part of her identity in a big way, didn't it?
And in the end, Ronnie got acquitted, and so it all ended happily.
This next question very well could be naivety on my part, Nemini, so please tell me if it is. But these are dangerous men who have violence in their history. they are partaking in activities which are, at best morally dubious. At any point, are you debating whether you should represent them?
You have no choice. And the rule at the bar, it's rather like if you're a black taxi, if your flag is up, you have to accept the fare, whether you like the look of him or not. Because if you could pick and choose your clients, some people would never get represented. And among those would be the plainly innocent. If your client says, I didn't do it, you've got to accept his word, even if it sounds a bit implausible. If he says, I did it, you've either got to get him to plead guilty, or you've got to return the brief. You can't knowingly assist him to commit perjury, to deceive the court. But you don't have to like your client. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because otherwise trial wouldn't be by jury, it would be by an individual barrister.
This is true. Although you did really like the Krays, am I right?
Yes, I mean, we got along fine. And you couldn't dislike them. They were so polite, so correct, so kind. They told me they didn't commit their crimes. At that time, they were largely engaged in what is called long-firm fraud, which is buying goods on credit and not paying for them. It's crime, but it's they weren't like the Richardsons torturing people. And who now remembers the Richardsons? Nobody.
So did it ever cross your mind to be afraid that you might not get them off when you were representing them? Were you ever scared of their reaction if you lost a case for them?
It never occurred to me.
That's confident.
Yes.
I heard a little bit about, was there a moment when they offered to pay you? They were very grateful and they wanted to pay you.
Oh, yes. They asked me to take up the case of Frank Mitchell, who was known as the Mad Axeman. And Frank Mitchell was a very sad figure. He was an East End boy. He was a huge man, but when you saw him, he looked as though he had mild Down syndrome. But when he was 10, he stole a fairy cycle, and he was sent to an approved school. And he never, ever saw the light of day again. And he got into trouble with that, so he went on, was sent to Borstal, got into trouble in Borstal, was sent to prison. The Krays were very sorry for him. I mean, it's an absolute scandal to think a child at the age of 10 could be sent away, and his family just abandoned him. But anyway, the Krays kind of adopted him, and I met him. He was in Wandsworth Prison in South London, and he was charged with attempting to murder a fellow prisoner. He was supposed to have stabbed him while they were walking round on exercise. But the Krays took up his case, and they instructed me to defend him. So I duly went down to Wandsworth, taking my little sister, which was very naughty. I pretended she was my pupil, and she was actually a novice nun. But I thought it was very good for her to see a bit of the real world.
What a field trip.
Yes. Anyway, we went down with Paddy Pakenham. We met Frank, and he was very polite and nice, but he wouldn't talk about his case, and he wouldn't engage with us. He was talking entirely about the brothers. And then, in the end, he said, and now they've sent me 2 lovely young ladies.
Oh, my goodness.
And he took our hands and started kissing them. And Paddy said, oh, give over, Frank. You can't marry them both. So the conference broke up without much progress. In those days, committal proceedings had to be done with live witnesses. So we went down to the South West London Magistrates' Court before an old dragon of a magistrate called Glenn Crask, but none of the witnesses to the alleged crime had seen anything. They all went back on their original statements of police. And the chap who was stabbed said, no, Frankie never done it. He's huge, but he's harmless. And even the attending prison officers said, no, they didn't see anything and they can't be sure. So the case was thrown out.
What was going on?
3 guesses.
To start with Kray.
The Krays were in the public gallery. The magistrate, I thought, was going to have a heart attack. But he had to dismiss the case. And the young barrister who was prosecuting stumped off in a rage. Ronnie then said, would you like a lift back across the water? Nobody likes to be the wrong side of the water. You know, there's this tremendous snobbery about north and south of the river, and they didn't like being south of the river. So he said, yeah, we'd love a lift. And then on the way back, Ronnie said, Mother would be highly honoured if you'd take tea with us. So we went back to Valence Road, which was the place in Bethnal Green where they lived. The house was decorated with sort of a red velvet wallpaper and lace curtains and bows on every window and a lot of horse brasses. Immaculately keen, everything polished.
Quite a sight.
Yes, and tea upstairs in a room like a boardroom with a long table with a Honiton lace tablecloth. Violet brought in tea on a tray, no mugs, proper bone china tea service with a teapot, cake on a stand, and Ronnie at one end of the table, Reggie at the other, and the acolytes sitting along the side of the table. And we sat down and we made sort of stilted conversation about things like traffic in Mare Street.
Pure small talk.
Yes, and then at the end, Ronnie stood up and said, Miss Lethbridge, on behalf of myself and all the members of the family, I would like to express my profound thanks for all you have done. And he handed me a big bundle of old £5 notes. And I said, Mr. Kray, I'm terribly sorry, but we're not allowed to accept money. Oh, no, I want to give you this gift of our appreciation. I said, I'm terribly sorry, I can't take it. Then Reg said, Nitto, Ron, use your loaf. And Ron said, oh, sorry, I shouldn't have done it in front of witnesses. And so everybody left. And he offered it to me again. And again I had to say, I'm so sorry. I really can't take it. And he thought I was completely nuts, I think. But anyway, he took it quite well. And then he organised a lift back to the temple for Paddy and myself. And as we went out, Paddy said to me, don't worry about that, Miss Lethbridge. They'll get you a nice crocodile handbag and I'll work it down to you somehow.
And did they?
No. Although I was very young, I had just enough common sense to know I had to be very careful.
You must have thought when you were sat at that boardroom table with the tea and the biscuits and the cake on the stand, I'm kind of in the heart of their HQ here. That's quite an intimidating space to be in, but you were also sort of in the heart of their business as their legal rep.
I had enough sense to know that I must not get too close to them, because that would be professional death. Over many years at the bar, I saw prominent criminal solicitors who acted for the prominent gangsters, and none of them survived.
Can you talk to me about why you left the legal profession, why you stopped being a barrister?
It was because I got married to Jimmy O'Connor. He was a man who, in 1942, had been convicted of murder, and he had served just short of 11 years of a life sentence and been released on licence, had worked for a time as a journalist, but had been refused entry to the union, the NUJ, had then started writing and had forged an extremely successful career as a writer for television. In fact, while in prison, he'd done a course with Ruskin College, Oxford, in drama, and he'd really educated himself. And in the end, he was commissioned by the BBC. Anyway, we got married. We managed to keep the fact that we were married private for 3 years, but then it got out, as it's bound to do. But after that, I couldn't get chambers. I was really frozen out. And it took me 18 years to get back. This again was partly the old class thing, but partly just pure misogyny, I think. But it was very odd. I went round the temple trying to get chambers, and nobody would touch me.
It must have been heartbreaking at the time.
It was awful. But then after 18 years, the climate had changed. I was invited to join a set which was run by a very old-fashioned liberal barrister called Louis de Pinna, who was extremely enlightened in his view, and he actually took black tenants and women.
Radical.
Yes. So I started all over again.
Is that what it felt like? Or that's what it was like? It was starting from scratch?
Yes, because I'd lost all my contacts. The Krays were in prison. But, I managed to get some work, and things were different. And I couldn't believe it when I went to court for the first time.
So you must have felt like you stepped into a completely different profession, really?
Yes, into a new world.
When you found out that the Krays were being tried for murder, how did you feel?
I knew that they had changed their way of life. They'd moved out of Bethnal Green. They had actually come to live here in Stoke Newington, in Cazenove Road, Cedar Court. And then they moved into Knightsbridge when they bought Esmeralda's Barn, which was a highly successful club and casino. And of course Ronnie had made friends with Lord Boothby and had moved into the House of Lords. And so the general public hadn't noticed or resented them while they were operating the East End. But when they got a bit uppity and above their station and came to the West End, the public attitude to them was quite different. Jimmy and I attended the trial, but I found it very unpleasant. I mean, they were horrible crimes. Any murder is horrible. There was a whole group of defendants apart from the twins. It was defended by a man called Peter Crowder, who was a barrister in establishment chambers, married to the daughter of an earl, an Etonian, a rather grand, posh figure, and talking about the murder of Jack the Hat. Jack the Hat was stabbed by Reggie and fell to the floor. And Peter Crowder said to the witness who was describing this, "And was he ambulant?" The chap didn't know what the hell he was talking about. This was really to put him down, to humiliate him, to show that he was a working class nobody who didn't understand proper English. If he had said, "Could he walk?" it would have been more appropriate. And this really set my teeth on edge. I thought that, quite apart from everything else, there is a horrible element of class in this whole thing. It is the habit of the Old Bailey for the judge to invite his preferred counsel to join him for lunch in the judge's dining room during the trial. And during one of these lunches, he invited my friend, who was a man who was then in silk, called Robert Hum. And the judge, who was notorious, Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson, a notorious sort of hanging judge, a tough judge. And he said during the course of lunch, "Mr. Ronald Kray, for once in his benighted life, spoke the truth today. He said prosecuting counsel is a fat slob, and the judge is prejudiced."
Oh my goodness. That is quite the one-liner.
It's brilliant, isn't it?
That's fantastic.
Yes.
What was your relationship with the Krays after they went to prison?
I lost contact with Reg. But Ronnie had a soft spot for me, I think. During the course of the trial, when I first walked into court, Ronnie, who was off with the fairies, and I walked into the court and he saw me and recognised me. He wrote a little note, which he gave to one of the prison officers to hand to me, and it said, "Dear Miss Lethbridge, you are more beautiful than ever. When I get out of this, I will take you to the moon."
Please say you still have it.
I've got it somewhere in a book.
Fantastic. Did he ever take you to the moon?
Oh, we're still waiting to go. Elon Musk will arrange it, I'm sure. But he kept in touch with me forevermore. He sent me a Christmas card every year, always posted on the 29th of October, and he invited me to tea at Broadmoor.
And did you go?
Yes.
How was that?
Yes, it was extraordinary. You arrive at Broadmoor, which of course isn't a prison. It's a national health hospital, but for the criminally insane. Anyway, when I arrived, I was met by Ron's butler, who was another patient who was wearing a white coat, who said, "Would you prefer Indian, Assam, Earl Grey, or China?"
You're pulling my leg.
I promise you I'm not. Ronnie came in and sat down, was very affable, and he said, "Shall I be mother? I'll pour." And honestly, he looked like the Queen Mother by this stage. He was very stout. And then he poured the tea, and then he said, "Would you like a meat pie? They warm them up lovely."
This is unbelievable.
Yes, and then he wanted favours from me, but he wanted me to take up the case of his then boyfriend and, various little legal favours. I managed to arrange for an appeal for his boyfriend. But it was all very affable. And I was told, do you know who I mean by Maureen Flanagan?
Can you give us some context?
Maureen Flanagan was Violet's hairdresser. On one of her visits to Ronnie in Broadmoor, one of the staff came across to her and said rather embarrassedly, "Mr. Kray's run up a rather large bar bill. It's now £7,000. Do you think the family could settle it?"
Oh, my goodness. There's a bar?
So, yes, the family had to whip round and find this money and pay off his bar bill in Broadmoor. And honestly, this is true. I mean, I know Maureen very well. I see her because I'm godmother to Charlie Kray's daughter.
So you are still very close.
Yes, I see Nancy, who's the last living member of the family. I see her regularly, but she's my godchild.
Then this seems like a good question to ask you, Nemini, because we're sat here in Stoke Newington, very near several landmarks of the Krays empire, which must feel surreal now to, be in the streets that they walked through. Yes. I wonder what you think their legend should be. What should their legacy be?
Well, it's got out of hand, hasn't it? I mean, there's been so much written and so much rubbish. The legend is much larger than the truth. They never ran round London with submachine guns, or one of the films showed them. I mean, there was an awful lot of nonsense written. But the truth is more interesting than the fiction, I think. And the truth, in some ways, is quite funny. There's a tradition in this country of the Robin Hood figure, isn't there? I mean, Robin Hood at the time, he was a thief and a robber, and he wasn't a good man. But in our folk memory, it's the Sheriff of Nottingham who's the villain, and Robin Hood is the hero, isn't he? It's very odd, isn't it? But when you've got a more structured society and law is fairly enforced, these people fade into oblivion. But, no, I've found my association with the Krays very interesting. And I don't regret a moment of it.
You have incredible stories and you tell them so well. Nemini, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Your memory for detail is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, for names, for times, it's amazing.
I find it much harder to remember when I clean my teeth this morning.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.